Well, hello to everyone tuning in on Zoom, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. My name is Libby Davies, and I'm joining you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish people. I'll be co-hosting tonight's panel alongside my co-host, Robin Browne. Hello, Robin.
Hello, everybody. I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
Well, welcome to everybody to today's panel discussion on the Liberal leadership race in Canada. Well, leadership transitions are pivotal moments in any political party's history, and the Liberal Party is no exception. In this critical time, with so much at stake, the leadership race is drawing attention across the country. Today, we will explore the players vying for the top spot, the issues shaping the race, and the impact of the outcome, both on the Liberal Party and the broader political landscape. Joining us for our conversation tonight are community organizer and political commentator, Jennifer Arp. Hello, Jennifer. Writer and policy researcher, a regular on our panel, Chuka Ejeckam. Hello, Chuka. Political advocacy and communications professional, Sabrina Grover, and Rabble's own senior parliamentary reporter, also a regular, Karl Nerenberg. So welcome to all of you. We also welcome our audience joining us on Zoom tonight, and we hope that you will participate in the chat and be sure to select the option that says to everyone when sharing your thoughts in the chat. And we encourage you to ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we'll certainly do our best, as always, to add your questions. Now, let's get started for tonight. Well, the twists and turns of any leadership race are fascinating to watch unfold. And the Liberal leadership race, of course, is no exception, especially in the extraordinary times that we're in right now, with an unfolding trade war with the US and the closure, or prorogation as it's called, of Canada's parliament. We have lots of questions to get into with our panelists. But first off, just some basics for context. I'm going to turn to Karl first because he's so good at knowing parliamentary history and how it all works. And Karl, lead us through just briefly the scenario of having a new leader of the Liberal Party to be chosen March the 9th, who may not be an existing elected member of Parliament. Can a new leader in those circumstances still act as the Prime Minister?
The short answer is yes. It may sound strange, but there's nothing in our constitutional history or practice that says that the Prime Minister actually has to be a member of Parliament. In fact, in 1925, William Lyon Mackenzie King, was the Prime Minister at the time. He had an election, he lost his seat, and he remained Prime Minister. It took a while until somebody resigned and he ran in a by-election, but for that whole period, interim period, he remained Prime Minister. Again, in 1945, exactly the same thing happened. So that's quite awesome.
Okay, good. So that just clears that up as a matter of information. Now, I know that you've been itching to also weigh in on what a new Liberal leader will face. So I'm just going to quickly follow up with that with you, Karl. We are living in extraordinary times. So what is it that you are hoping that the new Liberal leader will do, whoever he or she may be?
So we are, and I appreciate making allusion to a trade war. I'd say we're not just in a trade war here. We're in a battle for the survival of our country. Donald Trump is waging economic war against us, and it's getting bloody close to the other kind. And since the survival of our country is at stake, I'm going to pick up an idea from Craig Scott, a former colleague of yours, Libby, who said it's time for a national unity government. It's time for the government that Winston Churchill put together in Britain of multi-parties when he became Prime Minister during World War II. Somehow, the last thing we need after, and I presume it'll be Mark Carney, becomes Prime Minister, is a quick election. Much as there's politically that might seem tempting, the last thing anybody needs. What we need is a series of robust policies and a united front as much as we can. You may not get Pierre Poilievre to join it, but he may not make too much trouble. And I just think we just have to put partisan politics aside to the extent we can and say that our country really is at stake. It really is. And the government to the south of our border is not just angry about trade. It is a fascist government. They're investigating opposition members elected to the Senate. They are beyond rationality. They are a dangerous, potentially violent fascist government that lies every day. And we are just really have to get ourselves united and say, he wants to take us over. He is not kidding. And nobody's going to help us but ourselves.
Okay. Now, Karl, we'll definitely be coming back to this. So thank you for kind of putting that on the table. And I'm going to turn it over to Robin now.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue for a question to you, Sabrina. Welcome to the panel. You ran as a Liberal candidate in Calgary in 2021, so we're very interested to get your take on the Liberal leadership race. How do you see it shaping up with just a little more than 2 weeks to go?
Yeah, thanks so much, Robin. I think that the race has been extremely interesting for only having been a race for about 5 weeks, right? Normally, I think we're used to leadership races taking upwards of 3 to 6 months, and we've only had this race on the docket since the end of January, really, when the Prime Minister resigned. And what you've seen from the race is a fundamental shift in the Canadian voting public. We've not only seen kind of the momentum gather around, I would say, predominantly 3 candidates, although there are 5 candidates in the race. We've also seen a significant shift in voting intention from a general standpoint. So the lead between the Liberals and the Conservatives has decreased significantly. You're not seeing a 20-point lead like we were, in December 2024. And so I think that is probably the most exciting part of this race. And I think that this idea that you've got candidates out there raising significant dollars, more dollars than I think the party has really been able to bring in even over the last year, in a mere 6 weeks, you're really seeing momentum pick up. There were about 400,000 registered Liberals that have declared their interest in voting in the race. But now, as we head into kind of that voter ID and like voter activation period, that's when I think we might see that narrow down a little bit and narrow down a little bit from 400,000. But overall, I think the momentum of having even 400,000 people register in less than 3 weeks is pretty exciting. So from my standpoint, I just think that the momentum that the party's seeing today is unparalleled.
Okay. Thanks, Jennifer. It's hard to believe that here we are talking about the Liberal leadership race almost having ended, and we almost have forgotten that a prime minister resigned. What was that? Barely a month ago, and here we are. Move on. So actually, just to follow up with Jennifer now, I think it would be very interesting for you to share with us what you think the challenges will be for the new Liberal leader. Not the least of which is that there could be a non-confidence vote if Parliament actually does come back. Of course, there's now more and more speculation that a new leader could go straight to an election. We've got trade wars going on, all the issues in the South that I think Karl laid out so well. So how do you see it in terms of what these challenges will be for the new leader of the Liberal Party?
Well, thank you so much, Libby, for the question. I really think, as much as the shortness of this leadership race has been interesting, I also think it's going to be a challenge for the new leader. With a longer drawn out leadership race, you have the opportunity to really engage the party membership, to engage especially that youth vote and some of those pieces that are really critical to organizing heading into an election. And I think, seeing this leadership race happen in such a short period of time and also in the winter will mean that one of the challenges facing the new leader is really going back to the party membership and say, now I need you to step up and I need you to get on board and let's come together and we need to beat Poilievre. And there's really significant issues that our country is facing, and a Liberal government needs to be able to carry the torch and take it forward. I also think that telling their story and why they're different than Trudeau and why they're different than this government and what their policies are going to be that are different than the current government is going to be a challenge. We've seen that shift in the polls start to happen, but there is only one poll that matters, and that is election day. And once we head into election period, what voters will start to be thinking about will be different and more different than just the United States, right? Affordability is going to be an issue. And everything that we're facing right now is going to be an issue, and the amount of money that the government is spending, all of those things are going to be an issue. So will we see a shift in the polls following the leadership race? Potentially. As well, when you look at the nuts and bolts of what goes on in party organizing and behind the scenes, there's been a lot of resignations, a lot of MPs, a lot of cabinet ministers that have said they're not running again. That's going to be a challenge for the new leader, identifying the right team and putting the people around them that they're going to need to go into an election, if we're headed into an election. And if we're not headed into an election, then to make sure that we've got the right cabinet ministers in portfolios to be able to do the hard work that's going to need to be done. Election timing, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, but election timing is going to be another challenge. If we're heading, ending a leadership race and heading into enforced tariffs, that could impact when an election is called. And so all of those pieces, I think, really for a new leader, there's an immense challenge and an uphill ahead. So hopefully we can, the Liberals can take some of that momentum and carry it forward.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
All right. Actually, that's a good segue to bring Chuka in. Chuka, anybody who's listened to Off the Hill knows that you've always been a skeptic of the political agenda of powerful elites. So many Canadians are feeling like a lot of anxiety right now about what's happening under the Trump administration. So is our Canadian democracy, and maybe as Karl said, even our country, as imperfect as it is, at risk?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the Conservative Party is quite so venal as the Republicans, but I do think that the fundamental problem does exist here as well. The fundamental problem being corporations have amassed more power than governments. In the United States, of course, it's a very sort of almost comically overt expression of this, in that, there's one guy who's literally walking into government agencies and shutting them down. But the fact that corporations have an immense amount of influence over our lives, including on issues of climate change, on issues of sort of environmental preservation, things like that. And then, of course, the immense amount of influence they have in the labor market. I think that fundamental problem exists. And while it might not be as practicable in Canada to kind of just shut down agencies the way it's happening in the US, I think that sort of politics, where corporations are more forcefully exerting power over governments, I mean, they're watching one another pursue this, and they're taking notes, I think. It's certainly not difficult to imagine a mining company or an association of mining companies being more forceful in their engagement in Canadian politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just go ahead, Robin.
No, great point. Actually, I'm just curious as a follow-up, because I'm wondering if you think that the corporations here in Canada could take advantage of this kind of what's going on in the US, because it's so blatant. You're right, to kind of to push that message of, look how bad it is down there, when up here it's great. And also, and related to that, like I've noticed that like in a lot of pop culture, there's kind of like, dystopian stuff. There's like the common enemy, right? Whether it's the zombies or whatever. And the same thing could happen here, where a similar thing where you point to the US and say, hey, look how bad it is, but we're good. Like, you think that could become a dynamic?
I mean, I do think that probably still has like cultural relevance. I imagine like sort of colloquial Canadian political culture will lean into that quite a bit. But in terms of a common enemy, in regard to corporations and profiteers and whatnot, I think it's more. I would say that it's more likely that they will exploit fears about the trade war, the circumstances that Karl discussed. I think it's more likely that they would exploit fears about that in attempt to get concessions from the government, to sort of, to argue that the government has to rely on these corporations to maintain good relations with the United States, in that they aren't because the government won't be able to maintain them themselves. I would say that it's more likely the corporations will do that, exploit the situation to benefit themselves.
Mm-hmm. It does feel like there's a kind of a three-level chess game going on, both in Canada and the US, not only around trade, but how it's impacting Canadian politics. So I just want to come back to Karl and bring you back in. And just to put the facts on the table, Parliament has been prorogued, shut down, based on the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, going to the Governor General until March 24th. Liberal leadership race, March 9th, new leader. Calls from opposition parties to urgently recall Parliament to deal with the trade issues, while at the same time saying that they want to bring a non-confidence vote to make, to have the government fall, which seems somewhat contradictory, but there it is. So I guess the question I want to put to you, Karl, to sort of expand on what you were saying earlier, with this very complex situation unfolding before us, how likely is a recall of Parliament, noting that the last Parliament was utterly dysfunctional. I mean, they couldn't get any legislation through. Could a new leader even conceivably extend prorogation? There would be political consequences to that. I know that your view is that you would like to see the new leader make some kind of deal to keep things going. But realistically, what are the risks of each of these outcomes? Oh, you're on mute.
Trying to be well behaved and not interrupted, so I put myself on mute. So there are many risks to anything. If Mark Carney does win, and when I talk to Liberals, they fully expect that to happen, unless there's some huge something huge happening that we're not perceiving, then he would not. The transition period between him and Trudeau would actually take about 2 weeks. It wouldn't happen from one day to the next. It would take technically, it would take a little time before he actually would become Prime Minister. So he would likely be becoming Prime Minister just around the time when Parliament's supposed to come back. So there's he's already telegraphed, Carney, that, he's not telegraphing much about what he believes in or what he wants to do, but he telegraphed that he could call an election. So if he bothers to say it, since he says so little, he really means it. So if he's listening, I'm saying, don't try for another solution. It's too risky to call election. From a crass political point of view, it's too risky I think, for Carney to call election, because he's very, very inexperienced politician. Read today, the National Post hates him anyway, but they got him dead to rights in today's National Post, saying two different things in English and in French, and saying two different things in the same interview in French. And his French wasn't so good, so maybe he didn't know what he was saying. He didn't mean to say something different from what he said in the earlier part of the interview, which it means, way back, I'm old to remember when John Turner came back in politics. He was very experienced, but he was very rusty. He'd been out of politics a long time, and he made a lot of gaffes and said a lot of dumb things and got himself into a lot of trouble. I think he should govern, and I think I would hope that at least the NDP would see it that way, that, you people, I'm not a political professional for any party, so the people here who have lifelong and intense associations with the Liberal Party are seeing this as liberals and as political partisans. I'm looking at this as a Canadian, as a 77-year-old Canadian who was born barely after World War II, who has seen a goddamn awful lot, and I've never seen this. I've seen the action of American imperialism in Vietnam, in the Congo, in Chile, all over the world, but they usually kind of left us alone. Now we're facing a different kind of world. Putin and Trump are carving up the world. Trump gaslights Ukraine. Ukraine tells them they started the war when we all know the Russians invaded them. He runs around telling lies about Canada, which nobody in the United States refutes. We're subsidizing Canada to the tune of $200 billion a year, which is a meaningless thing, means nothing. And he really means it when he wants to take over Greenland and then Canada. He is hell-bent on glory. He's hell-bent on being the great emperor of North America in a new world based on the 1890s. He says that as well, of spheres of influence. We need a government. We need people, all the politicians and the political activists and the political professionals, to rise above their partisan stripe. We're not going to get it from Polyev, but at least we should get it from the NDP and the Liberals, and maybe even from the Bloc, and focus on Canada now, not on their political advantage.
Okay, thanks, Karl.
Yes, thank you. All right. Actually, this question we want to actually throw it to all the panelists, but we'll let's give the question, then we'll see what we're going to start with. But in his recent podcast interview with Jordan Peterson, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre criticized wokeism and urged society to, quote, put aside this obsession with race. He also argued wokeism invented race and that race was imported to Canada from the US. So do you think these messages will resonate with many Canadians? So let's start with Chuka, and anybody else who wants to jump in afterwards, go ahead.
I mean, I would say that the people who would be convinced by those arguments are already convinced by those arguments. I don't think that they convince people. I think people who hold those beliefs already respond to them. I think, I don't think that, I don't know that Poilievre is like a committed fascist. I don't think he believes in anything enough to be a committed fascist. And if he is a white supremacist, I imagine it to be largely in the sort of passive way that people become white supremacists through ignorance. Although I'm sure it's not entirely ignorance on his part. But I think what's important to note is that this language about, wokeism and an obsession with race that's the exact language that Musk and the Trump administration are using to completely dismantle the U.S. government. And like, I hate the U.S. government, but I hate it for the exact opposite reasons that they do, which is, I mean, it's quite astounding. To shut down USAID and identify the few good things that they do, as opposed to like the sort of foreign interference and meddling and whatnot. It's quite something. And so I think that is the more specific thing to note. Whether or not, what exactly Poilievre is trying to do, I don't know. I don't know if he knows, but ultimately, I don't think that it matters. I think that it's a sort of the specific kind of language that is being advanced by, amazingly, like this group of rich white South Africans who are all involved in PayPal or in some way, one way or another. People who openly say that democracy is a failed experiment. People like Peter Thiel, who now have a lot of connections to the White House, and I think to follow up on what you said, Karl, about a unified Canadian response, I imagine that the some of the difficulty with that will be less so about the parties and more generational difficulty in that, you mentioned you've witnessed U.S. imperialism in Vietnam, in the Congo and whatnot, and I think that there are some people who are willing to accept that or think that that's okay. And then there's an increasing number of people, especially younger people, who don't think that that's okay and who don't want relations with a country or with governments that do those things. And so, unless Canada has a position on settler colonies, right? One that's, it sort of pretends to be against them, even though it sanctions all the ones that exist and supports the further establishment of one in Palestine. So, in terms of a unified Canadian response, there are a lot of people in this country, I imagine, who would agree with what's happening to the U.S. government, and who would want to see that happen here. And so, I don't know that you could exactly come together.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in there on Poilievre's comments against wokeism and race being invented and imported from the U.S.?
We've had race in Canada all along. When white people came here from Europe, there were other people living here, and there were slaves in Canada in its very early history. So race has been a part of Canadian life right from the very, very beginning of the settlers in Canada. So that's a ridiculous point for them to make. But just as to Chuka's point, in the hope for unity, I guess I'm sensing another kind of generational division. I think people of my generation are really scared for all its faults. Our country still is that somewhat more compassionate, somewhat more egalitarian, somewhat more reasonable, somewhat less violent, somewhat more caring, and somewhat more hopeful society, and somewhat less individualistic society than the United States. And I'm just feeling that, I wrote an article saying that to Trump and his gang, we represent something they want to stamp out. They don't want to have an alternative way of being that looks like them but is all those things that they are not, just sitting on their top border, and they want to stop it. The fact that the Vice President of the United States wouldn't, no, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, wouldn't go to a G20 meeting in South Africa because the themes of the meeting were fostering greater equality between the North and the South and climate change. He said, it's all about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and climate change, and Trump is against that. It's insulting to Trump. The fact that they start yelling at Zelensky saying he should apologize for Donald Trump for calling him a liar when Donald Trump lies. He should get on his hands and knees. I mean, sometimes when the threat is great enough, I go back. My father fought in World War II. He was overseas. Most of my Jewish family in Europe were murdered by the Nazis. Only the few who had gotten here survived, and one person out of the whole family in Poland survived. I'm not saying we're getting there. I'm not saying we're getting there now to that extreme, but we are dealing with an actual authoritarian fascist regime. And that's the point where the so-called liberal capitalist type and socialists and anti-imperialists and all the different other gradations in a country like Canada have to come together and say, he wants to take us over. There is no trade war, folks. It is an economic war, the purpose of which is to deprive us of meaningful sovereignty. If they wanted to change trade rules, they'd pick up the phone and call and negotiate a change in trade rules. That's not what Mr. Trump is doing. He is
Anyway, I'm going to jump in there, Karl.
I'm getting overwrought. I'm sorry.
No, you're not. You're not actually.
I'm much more passionate than the rest of you, and I'm surprised you don't share my passion. I'm surprised you're so calm about it.
No, I think actually everybody shares the sense of outrage that you're displaying and the feeling about it. I mean, I think everybody has that. We're also sort of trying to go back and forth between the Liberal leadership race and an election or not, and what's happening in the US and how that influences what's going on. And I just want to bring back in Jennifer and Sabrina, because having you both on our panel today is just a real opportunity to kind of get a sense of how people are feeling inside the Liberal Party, not only with the leadership race, but what I think more importantly, what comes of it. And I guess one question, and again, Karl flagged this earlier, should the new Liberal leader try to make a new deal with Mr. Singh? If there was a sense that there was going to be some sort of unity government, it has been put out there, people are talking about it. It's a speculation. I'm just curious to know whether or not you hear anything along those lines within your Liberal circles. Is this something that people are saying, oh God, we should get back and have a good deal and keep the government going and focus on the issues before us, etc. Are you hearing anything like that, or what do you think about that kind of proposal? Maybe Jennifer, you can go first, and then we'll follow up with Sabrina.
Maybe I'll let Sabrina. I'm not quite as engaged as I have been in the past. So maybe I'm coming in with a bit of a different perspective, which is a longtime party member who has been a staffer, who's knocked on the doors and done all the things, and then, taken a step back and is looking at what is happening in Canada and in relation to the US, and this time for a leadership race, and listening to children who are coming of age and their anxieties, which are not that much different than Karl's anxieties, and not knowing what to do, and are looking at their elected officials and saying, why do we need to have an election right now? My opinion of what should happen next actually isn't that much different than Karl's. That might not be the popular political opinion, but, at some point we have to be thinking bigger. I think, unfortunately, the Liberal leadership race is pulling the party in a direction that will make a deal with the NDP, I think, a little bit unlikely, because what we're seeing with the Liberal Party is a move to something that I cringe at, back to the center, because I don't fully understand what back to the center actually means. and a shift in policy and direction and something to the right will make the policies between the Liberals and the NDP further apart and that much harder to make a deal in order to keep government going. We'll see, once there is a new leader in place in those first couple of weeks, and as the transition happens, and if Trump goes ahead and enforces tariffs during that transition period, what will happen next? But as much as I would love to see a deal that keeps Parliament open, the work of government happening in defense of Canada, and serving the people who have sent MPs to Ottawa, serving the people. I hope that it continues, but I'm a little pessimistic about it right now, and I think we're going into an election. At a time that we shouldn't be going into an election. We're living one in Ontario provincially at a time that we shouldn't be having an election. And I think we're about to do the same federally. And I think that's harmful. I think it's harmful to democracy, quite honestly. And beyond harmful to the issues that Canada is facing, I think it's harmful to democracy.
Yeah, well, thank you for your frankness. And see, there you go, Karl. You've got a kindred spirit right here on the panel with you. Now, over to you, Sabrina. What is your view of how folks that in the Liberal Party, do you think they want to go an election? They want to see a new deal with the NDP? Or what's your own feeling on that too?
So I think that there's no reason why there couldn't be a deal with the NDP. I think the balance of power really does rest with the Liberals now, though, and will rest with the Liberals at the end of this leadership race. I think that the NDP has, when you look at the polls and you look at where the NDP is from a political perspective, there's not much that pushes them into wanting an election. And so I think that no matter who the leader of the Liberals are, whether it is a more center, candidate like Mark Carney, or if it's someone, further center left like Karina Gould, I don't think it would be hard to strike a deal with the NDP. I think that Jagmeet Singh has shown that he's generally willing to create those deals. I will say, though, I disagree with Karl. I think that the best thing is to go into an election. And I would say that because you watched an incredibly dysfunctional, almost non-functional parliament for months. The last 4 months of the parliamentary session in the fall were chokeholded by the Conservatives, who refused to move off of their point of privilege on the Sustainable Development Technologies Corporation. So you had 4 months of literally almost nothing getting done. We had a pull together the last minute. Karina Gould and the other House leaders on the Liberal side had to pull together this opportunity to have the fall economic statement read, to have the supply and to have supply and estimates passed. I don't think that there's any proof that this is a parliament that, if we went back to the session, that they would be able or capable of coming to an agreement. I think that, there's still a risk that the NDP would not come to the table with a deal. And that leaves the opportunity open for an election being called on a vote of non-confidence. And I think if you're a Liberal in this country right now, and you've seen the polls close, to the less than 10% gap that they are now. You've seen Mark Carney come out, I think, with a 25 or 20 point gap over being the best poised to deal with Donald Trump. And you have, a couple $1 million raised, hundreds of thousands of volunteers engaged. There's really no better time if you're looking at from a political perspective to go into an election. The Liberals have the organization, they have the staff, they have the money, they have the campaign set up. And they have the momentum. And I think at a time when you're actually watching the Canadian public turn away from the news and turn away from paying attention to some of these issues, you want to be able to capture the momentum of the last few months and actually go in, capture their attention for an election and get it over with. Least of which, because I think that Donald Trump is going to not negotiate with a unity government. I agree with Karl on the points of why Donald Trump is after us. I don't think it has anything to do with trade. I think it really only has an end game with taking our resources, which I think some folks in the chat have mentioned as well. But at the end of the day, I think In order for Canada to move forward, we need stability as well in our federal government, both to negotiate external trade deals outside of the United States, to build up a defense system that's capable of warding off the United States, and to break down internal provincial trade barriers. And so I think that having a stable government is part of that equation.
Okay, well, thanks to Sabrina and Jennifer. You guys were very frank in your responses. I know the chat has been very lively, and there's lots of questions coming in that sort of follow up what each of you have been saying. So I think we're going to just jump right into
Libby,
audience
could
questions.
I say something very quickly?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to clarify. I'm not against a unity government on principle. My question is, to what end? Would a unity government be more likely to oppose the genocide in Palestine? Would it be more likely to end for-profit mining or Canada's hosting of for-profit mining companies and associations? I mean, on present trajectories, the future of this world is mass death in the global south and fascism in the global north. Like, I don't think that that's a future worth defending. I don't think it's a future that anybody should want to be a part of. And so if a unity government is just, I mean, Carney, whatever he claims, Carney's a neoliberal like all the others. I just don't see how any of this is different, or how it gets outside of the problems that got us here.
Robin.
Boy, is that ever a good kind of segue or picking up on our very first audience question. And again, anyone can jump in on these, but although Chuka just did. But here's the question. In a national unity government against tariffs and economic blackmail, what would happen to other key issues like climate change, housing, poverty, etc., where such severe differences exist between parties? So again, anyone can jump in on that one.
I mean, I assume that they would congregate on the right. That is what has happened for the past, I don't know, 3-4 decades, maybe, yeah, 4 decades, like since the era of Thatcher, Reagan, and Mulroney. Those are the things that it's easiest to shed from one's political program. Those are the things for which people pay the least political costs. They don't take aggressive questions from the media when they're talking about cutting spending. It's easy. It's not. They don't invite political problems for themselves if they just move to the right.
Okay, anybody else?
I mean, I'll just say quickly, going back, I mean, so history doesn't necessarily rhyme and it doesn't repeat itself. But when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain, he was a dyed-in-the-wool racist and imperialist. He was no friend of the people of what we used to call the Third World, and he was certainly no friend of progressive policies towards the working class. Britain all came together and said, we still want to keep this as a country. We don't want Hitler to overrun our country. That's a fundamental. So then we can fight amongst ourselves. So what happened? Churchill won the war, and then what happened?
I mean, the Soviet Union won the war.
Election.
The Soviet Union won the war. Britain didn't win.
Okay, no, but Churchill allowed Britain to. Churchill did not surrender, and allowed a Western front to be maintained in Europe, while the Soviet Union made the most sacrifices so you could have a pincer operation. The point is, I'm making another point. The immediate election after the war, many Canadians don't know that. Churchill lost badly. You had the biggest landslide for the Labour Party, for any party ever in British history. And I think one of the greatest prime ministers of England is never properly recognized, Clement Attlee. He brought 20% of the economy under public ownership. He brought in the National Health Service. He brought in the Britain that we sort of knew. Thatcher did her best to destroy it. And Reagan picked up from Thatcher, Mulroney picked up from Reagan and Thatcher, but that's what we had. We had the highest marginal tax rate in countries like Britain and Canada, 90% on the highest amount of income people earn. So we had a very different kind of society. So they united together with Churchill. The working class got behind Churchill as long as they needed him, and then they booted him out, and they brought in a democratic socialist government.
Karl, it reminds me of Seth Klein's book, The Good War. And we've had Seth Klein on here, and he actually argues to have sort of a national unity emergency government approach based on climate emergency. That sort of was his whole argument. It seems to me that the closest we ever got to anything like that in recent history was during COVID, where, you know, emergency measures were brought in. Basically, the Liberals, the NDP, I think the Bloc supported a number of them, you know, to deal with what was perceived to, it was a pandemic, it was an emergency. But I actually don't know how people feel about that today. But there is another audience question that's related. So you can all jump in again. So this is another question that's come in. What will be the impact of Musk's support for Poilievre and AI, and what impact will AI have on the federal election? Like, how much are we captive to these huge forces playing out to the south of us and even globally? And what will that do to the Canadian election? Should we have one? Any thoughts on that?
I'll just jump in kind of off of the first question first. So I think that personal affordability and economic issues to the household and to the individual still are one of the top, you know, 3 polling issues that Canadians are concerned with. And so I think there's a group of folks on this call, panelists and folks who are engaged, who I would classify as in kind of that top 3% of engaged Canadians who are paying attention to the news every day, who know what Donald Trump is saying, who are really concerned about that existential threat. But I would say there's a large bulk of Canadians who are not as engaged as, you know, the 60 or 70 people on this call, who every day are still living those affordability pocketbook issues. And so, you know, to that first question about how will we deal with those issues, I think it's really important that whoever does become leader of the Liberals or any of the parties, we do continue to focus on that. Because I think that if you aren't able to address those questions, which the Democrats were not able to really successfully do and haven't been able to successfully do really for 2 election cycles in the United States, that is what allows this kind of fascist approach to seed. And that's what you saw Donald Trump do, right? A lot of people voted for Donald Trump, not because they thought race didn't exist, although there's obviously undertones of racism and white supremacy. A lot of them voted because of what they thought that Donald Trump would focus and help them with on economic issues. And so I think that that's part of the consideration of how you frame this debate in Canada. I think when we talk about the AI piece, we haven't seen AI make a significant impact on politics yet in Canada, but we are severely overexposed to foreign interference. We know that as a result of the commissions that have happened in the last year. We also know that based on just interactions in nominations and other, you know, grassroots party activities. And I think that that is a larger concern than the impact of AI. I think the Musk endorsement of Pierre and kind of the Pierre Jordan Peterson relationship will be important only if the other side can make it important. I don't think that conservative voters are necessarily turning away from Pierre Poilievre because of that, but there's a large number of voters that would be undecided that you would want to engage on that issue and define that for them at the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would love to jump in.
Yeah, Jennifer.
And then just picking up off of what Sabrina was saying, you know, I think AI aside, I mean, we all feed the algorithm, right? We all click on the things. We're all feeding the conservative narrative, right? Those are even my progressive friends, you know, we share, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're saying this, or I can't believe they're lying about that. And I, you know, spend a lot of time telling people, don't click on it, don't engage with it, right? We have to fight against it. And I think until progressives can really figure out how to make the algorithms work for them, you know, we're going to continuously be fighting an uphill battle against misinformation. You know, we are, one of the things that we pride ourselves on as progressives is we don't like to lie. Well, what we're seeing on the right is blatant lies. And nobody there, and low information voters, quite frankly, that aren't, you know, questioning. You know, there's rumors circulating in Canada that the reason why we have so many Sikhs in Canada and why we have so many problems is because Jagmeet Singh made a deal with Trudeau and the floodgates opened. That's the type of stuff that's circulating on social media. And until progressives can actually figure this out, we're going to be fighting against it. And it's eroding trust in our institutions as a result. And so I do think beyond AI, it's imperative. It's imperative that this is the piece that we need to get into place, or or conservatives will continuously be one step ahead.
Okay.
I'll just say one thing to Jennifer's. I was just going to say one thing to Jennifer's point. I think there's two things I'd like to say to that. Like, number one, I think this idea that progressives aren't harnessing digital technologies is really, really true. If you look at the way that Republicans target voters on digital platforms, and I think that can be applied to the conservatives in Canada, it's very, very sophisticated. And I think progressives have let that fall. And I think that that's why we don't have a coalesced digital community in the same way that the right does. And I think that the other thing I'd say is something that I struggle with is you do have this large population of uninformed or, those folks falling into disinformation and conspiracy lies and all of that. And I think the question from progressive side has to be, how do we not just push back, but also in some ways like engage with those people? Right? Like this idea when you turn on the Daily Show and you turn on Seth Meyers and we're mocking those people, doing fun fake interviews, calling them stupid. That doesn't really work at the end of the day when you're trying to build a country. It creates more division and it doesn't bring those people over to your side on information and voting. So I think that that's an outstanding question that we haven't really dealt with.
Okay. Robin, back to you for more audience questions.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think this next one kind of might relate to what Jennifer was saying there in terms of misinformation, but here it is. Coming off an autumn of elections, which I think they're probably referring to the American election there, plus the Ontario election, plus the Liberal leadership race. Do you think Canadians are going to be too burnt out to vote in the upcoming federal election, and how can we combat this? Anyone can jump in.
I think people who want to vote are going to vote. I mean, it's like, yeah, I think people who want to vote are going to vote. It doesn't seem to me that it would be frequent enough that it would cause fatigue, especially since Canadian elections are very different than U.S. elections, and there's nowhere near the amount of time or money that's devoted to them. So I think people who want to vote are going to vote. I do want to say I do take the point about the media platforms and whatnot. I do think that with like Twitter and Facebook, these are owned by billionaires who are interested in lower taxes and being able to buy states and islands and whatnot. And so they serve the right, I would say, more so than the left. And then, there was a significant left-wing presence on TikTok, and then it got banned because of that reason. So I think it's kind of an uphill battle in that regard as well.
So just quickly to say that, especially to Sabrina, who's talking about the bread and butter issues, affordability, that this may be just a normal election, if we were to have an election now, where people are just most concerned, what are you going to do for me 10 minutes from now, not what are you going to do for my country for the next millennium. I'm not sure about that. We have people booing the U.S. They're not politicized people who go to hockey games and boo the U.S. anthem. And we have a 25% drop for WestJet in trips to the United States. They interview people who are not political people, not activist people, not people who are particularly engaged, canceling the trips to Florida at a cost of $1,500. $1,500, the average person, a lot of money. And so people are very taken. Patriotism is in fact, many people on the left are uncomfortable with patriotism for good reason, because it's so often abused. But some sense of patriotism is emerging. Many people I know who've been watching politics for as long as I have and longer are just saying we've never seen anything like this before. This unifying of the country around, we want to continue to exist. This is a real threat. And I'd say, first place, that we've had more time. I have not seen a single sentence from Mark Carney, for instance, or from Chrysler Freeland, where they say how they would help one person make their life more affordable for half an hour. So if the Liberals think the affordability is a big issue, they have so far offered zero, nothing, no policy. Mark Carney's Policy Today, read it. It says not a single word about that issue. Nothing. It talks about running, in fact, it talks about running a balanced budget operationally and on capital expenditure, which is all long-term for the future, being willing to incur deficits. Nothing about making anybody's life better right now who can't afford milk or eggs or bread. Nothing. Not whatsoever. No policy. So you've got to hope that he's got, on all the change in the polling, and I agree, and much of it is actually bleeding from the NDP and Greens to the Liberals, not from the Conservatives to the Liberals. But either way, all the change in the polling is about the new tenor and situation where we feel threatened as a country and who can deal with it. And as one of you mentioned, the 25% advantage that Carney has as somehow magically the person who can negotiate with Trump. I would warn Mark Carney, you're not ready for an election. You do not have the skills. You make mistakes and you blunder every time you're in an interview. You really could suddenly flame out like a Kim Campbell. Don't do it. Don't be arrogant just because you're a bank governor. Give yourself time if you're going to talk by the time until October. You need the time. The country needs the time as well. To get to see you and get to see what you can do and to get its act together so that we can fight the real threat to us. But he's not a politician yet. He's not a person who can do it.
So, Karl, just want to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, and a couple of others have mentioned as well, and that is what we're talking about also a generational question. I mean, you've clearly laid out this is a matter of like war to you. It's a matter of saving the country, unity government. Others are not so, don't see it quite that way. But, here's an audience question that I think picks up on those themes. It says, and I invite each of you to say something, with so much climate anxiety and general feelings of fear about the future, how can politicians better appeal to millennial and Gen Z Canadians? So, I mean, is part of this like a whole generational question, whether people want an election, they don't want an election, what they see as the biggest threat or not a threat, or people just feeling totally turned off that they don't even want to engage? And any thoughts on that?
I mean, in my opinion,
younger people, not from me.
In my opinion, if a politician can't openly acknowledge that capitalism is at this point a threat to human existence, then they have nothing to offer this century. Because if you can't confront that, if you're not willing to deal with the material reality that we exist in because of the actions of profiteers who lied for decades, who exploit every person that they can, who employ mercenaries to murder people who oppose their projects. If you can't confront that, then, I mean, what good are you?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Anybody else?
I'll jump in.
Yeah. So, Jennifer.
I think maybe not quite to the same level as Chuka's point, but maybe not far off. And I think that, the issues that especially Gen Z sees as issues are very different, right? They see a world, they see a lifestyle that they don't think they will ever be able to attain. And so politicians really, and quite honestly, we know what the largest voting bloc is, right? Which is that 18 to 35, that 18 to 30 is the largest voting bloc. It is the largest population. And if politicians could come up with policies that engage with, that speak to, we recognize it's a different world now. We recognize it. We recognize affordability is a big issue beyond just paying for groceries, right? You may not be able to afford that house that your parents are living in because we just haven't been able to keep up. And if politicians can't speak to that, I think, we're going to continue to see this divide. I think that there is fear amongst the oldest generation and the youngest generation. We have family discussion, my parents and my children, right? And the things that they're worried about, actually, it's not that much different. The approach is different, right? And how they want to engage with through the political process. But it really, at the end of the day, isn't that much different. And so how do we bring it together? And, us Gen Xers maybe need to get out of the way for a little bit and bring those generations together, and we might actually see some progress being made.
And I'll just quickly hop in, and I apologize. I have to leave a few moments early after my little interlude here. I would say that I think Gen Z is not homogenous, and I would say that one of the major red flags of Gen Z voters is young men. And you saw that increasingly play out in the United States election. And I think if you go back and you look at the targeting of the Republicans, that really played to their favor. Young men feel left behind, whether rightfully or wrongfully, whether that's true or not true. I think we could debate that, but that's how they feel and that's their perspective. So you're seeing a ability for conservative and right-leaning politicians and policymakers to really speak directly to that group and that category of people, saying that you are feeling left behind or you are left behind because of these ideas of wokeism and the idea that DEI has put you in those positions, and that's why you are graduating less frequently than women in college, and that's why you're experiencing income disparities. And I think that's a serious problem that we have not resolved, and that I think could play a significant impact in the Canadian election. You already saw Pierre Poilievre target young men with his voting. With his ads and the ability to tag them to reach the right people. I think that really plays differently for Gen Z, and that's not something you saw in millennials. It's not something that we see in Gen X. With millennials and Gen X, I think not only are they concerned about their own lives, I do think that they're concerned about their children's lives as well. So I think these issues of climate change and affordability and healthcare continue to be an issue that they're going to focus on. And I agree, with Karl, like this, I think that the attention being paid today to patriotism and to national identity is quite large. But even if you look at what's happened in the Ontario election, you've seen the gap close between Doug Ford and Bonnie Crombie, largely not on issues related to Ontario's ability to beat back Donald Trump, but largely around the issue of healthcare. And so I think that, regardless of this overwhelming issue, people don't like to be constantly reminded about doom and gloom and this existential threat. And I think that that's when they turn off the TV and they turn off this conversation. And that's when I think that, we do have to still think about those bread and butter issues. And I apologize, I now have to hop off.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. And I think we've got time for the last question, just short answers. I'll turn it over to Robin.
Actually, Libby, I think we're kind of down to, we're at 8:27 right now. Yeah. So actually, before I move on to the closing, I think I just want to agree. Oh, she's gone already, but there's ample evidence to back up what Sabrina was saying in terms of men are struggling. If you look at the book by Richard Reeves of Men and Boys, there's real structural things happening in the economy that have happened that are affecting young men, but the right, the populists come along and go, oh yeah, you're having a hard time, and blame it on the women, blame it on the trans people, blame it on the black. That's what's going on, right? But anyway, but that is all the time we have for questions today. So thank you all to our wonderful guests. So Sabrina's already gone, but Jennifer, Karl, Chuka for joining us today. Our live political panel, Off the Hill, will return in April. We're taking a break in March when we will discuss the federal election. So thank you, as always, to Rabble for hosting these great panels. And if you'd like to support this show and the other great work that Rabble does, please consider becoming a monthly donor at rabble.ca/donate. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and we will see you in April. Thank you, folks, for a great panel. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.